I need something if I'm gonna do teacher persona like all the way up until
Yes.
9:30.
Yes, you definitely need some moo or chocolate if you're going to be animated and expressive and exciting.
I miss Moo. All my students thought it was such trash, but I was like, listen, I have a lot of like positive, like nostalgic feelings for Moo.
So can you please, just for the audience, tell us your name and a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Ren Powers, and I guess part of the connection that we had between us is that I had been working in Russia for about 4 years up until pretty much the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And we were somewhat ships passing, I suppose, because now I'm in British Columbia, which is, as I understand it, it's kind of where you're from originally. So and yeah, I guess my connection on going to Russia, I still do some online classes with Russian clients from time to time. And as well, over on TikTok, I'm working on a Dostoevsky chronological read through series. So that's been a source of fun. I wish that he had more things set in Moscow because I did not spend as much time in St. Petersburg. So there's the nostalgia doesn't quite hit that same way, but that's been really fun as well. My language teaching journey actually went back quite far because when I was studying at university, I was doing a degree in Germanic studies. And obviously, like if you're studying a language, a lot of people, I think pretty much anybody who studies a language at university has the question of like, oh, are you going to teach that language? And my interest in German and Germanic studies had nothing to do with teaching at all. And it was more like I had lived there as a teenager. And so it was just sort of a logical progression. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. But while I was studying part of my degree in Germany, I had the opportunity to do a teaching internship at a high school there. And when I was like barely older than any of the students there. And I just really, really liked that. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, you know what? That's a thing I could do actually, maybe. And so then I sort of pivoted, and even within the German department, I started doing a few different more teaching oriented classes. And initially, I thought I wanted to teach English in Germany, but as a non-EU resident, it was really, really going to be very difficult to get that type of job in a EU country. So I was sort of looking at other places, but a lot of other popular English teaching destinations, you have to start off by teaching kids. And I knew I didn't want to do that. And so I was looking around at what was available where you could actually work with adult learners. And one of my best friends at university was from Moscow. And he was like, well, I went to a language school in Moscow, and, I was an adult. So obviously they have that exists there. And so I looked at Russia, and it was also a place I knew I would have had to have applied for a tourist visa to even go there. And I thought, well, I would have to put in all that effort just for a tourist visa. I'll just apply for some jobs in Moscow and see what happens, and end up staying in Russia for 4 years. So
Wow.
obviously there was something good about it.
And in Russia, which cities were you able to teach in?
Yeah, so I pretty much just applied the first round of jobs to schools in Moscow, and I interviewed with two or three. And then I ended up working in Moscow for one company for 3 years. And then I also worked in Yuzhno Sakhalinsk on Sakhalin Island out east. And I
Wow.
did that for 1 year. Yeah.
Sakhalin, that's quite a unique place. How different is that from Moscow?
Yeah, certainly. So I would say one of the first things I think I was told by my students when I was teaching in Russia in Moscow was that there's Moscow and then there's the rest of Russia, and I definitely found that to be true moving out east. I would say I think the first thing that probably most people going outside of Moscow would realize about any other city, more or less, is the roads. Um,
Hmm.
Living on Sakhalin, it was very much like being on a roller coaster anytime you were on the roads. And that was actually like a really big point of discussion in my classes, even among my students. There, I was teaching mostly teenagers, and that was something that they had a lot to say about. They had a lot of opinions about the state of the roads on the island. Another thing that was very interesting is that because it was fairly remote, most of the influence that it had was coming from Korea and from Japan because it was closer to those
Yes.
countries. So they have a lot of people there whose background is actually Korean. There was a big influx of Korean immigrants over there. So a lot of people had family in Korea, had traveled there quite a bit, or had also been to Japan, were studying Japanese in school, that sort of thing. Which compared to Moscow at the time that I was there, I know that this has changed a little bit, and there's a lot of interest right now in Moscow, especially among younger people in Japan. But at the time that I lived there, that wasn't true. Most people's interest in travel lay to the west, not to the east. And so that was a really big difference for sure, also, just that influence on the culture out in Sakhalin.
But talking more about your move to Russia, what
Mhm,
was the biggest, let's say, shock to you moving from your original country of origin to Russia?
mhm. Gosh, I think if I had to pick one thing to start, because we've sort of talked a little bit about a couple of things, but I would say like probably the very first thing that really struck me was just visually the scale of everything in Moscow specifically is just so big. And I think as long as I lived there, I don't think I ever quite got used to that. Like, not in the sense of like, wow, I'm just like, that's astonishing. But it was just sort of like every now and again, it would really strike you like, no, this building really takes up this entire city block. Like, this building is really huge. These ceilings are really this tall. And I'm not a big person. So, I mean, a scale already, I mean, I'm scaled down anyway, but like it was just astonishing to me. The parks, huge, just everything, the amount of space that everything took up and how grand everything feels, especially downtown. But I mean, honestly, even going outside of the city center, you have places like Vidinha, just out in what I would consider, and I think most cities would be kind of like the outskirts. But suddenly you have this grand, huge, beautiful park to walk through, and that people have access to things like that just so readily. That was so astonishing to me, the scale of everything. The second thing was definitely just the public transportation in general, the networking of it, how accessible it was to everyone, that how diverse even that was, like the buses, the trams. You could take a marshrutka, you had the just normal buses, the metro, like the taxi. I mean, there was just so many ways to get around, never mind just walking if you wanted to try to walk where you needed to go from one place to another. But the metro was just such a surprise to me because again, not coming from having had anything to do with Russia before, I'd never heard of this. I had no idea it was there. So imagine my surprise going to my the office where I was going to work at for the first time. And they're like, oh, you just have to go get this metro station. It's like over here. I was living at Babushkinskaya at the time. So it was just all the way up on the Brown line. And walking into that metro station compared to some of the others is not interesting. It's very standard. There's no grand architecture associated with it, but still coming from a place where the most probably lauded public transportation in the country is like the New York subway, maybe the Chicago Loop. I mean, these are not impressive places. And
Right.
so even just the first time seeing such a simple metro station in Moscow, I was a bit like, okay, that's interesting. And then making it slowly my way downtown from there and noticing like, wait a minute, these are very fancy. These are very it's beautiful. I just that I was not prepared. I was not prepared.
So would you say living in Moscow, there's a sense of convenience?
I think that would be an understatement. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And then even just going off of that, the walkability of each of the districts, I think, is so much better than in a lot of big cities that I've been to, even in Europe, where I think with the even in cities that have mixed zoning, I do still think that sometimes there would be like, oh, I have to walk, maybe 15 minutes to get to a grocery store or something like that. And maybe I just got lucky, but I never lived anywhere in Moscow or in Sakhalin for that matter, where the grocery store wasn't pretty much, there wasn't like a grocery store connected to each sort of block of flats. And it was pretty much like less than 10-minute walk to any grocery store or at least some kind of convenience store anywhere that I lived in either city. The freedom of movement that gives you, I think coming from the US, from most cities, I think in the US, most places in the US, you don't really realize how much freedom you don't have to get from place to place unless you have a car until you live in a place like Moscow. I'm not a driver in the first place. I was really lucky that when I was growing up, I did live in one of the places where everything that I needed was close enough that it was walkable, but that was so unusual. And anywhere else I'd ever lived in the US, I never ever realized how claustrophobic that could be until I lived in a place where all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I can go from one end of the city to the other. I might have to change trains once and I might have to take a bus. And it might take a while, like it might take longer, possibly depending on the traffic, than it would have taken to take a car. But I could just read a book the whole time. I didn't have to think about it. I wasn't driving. like, and I could suddenly have access to like, oh, that bookstore is like in Lubyanka and I live in Prospekt Vernadskого, whatever, I'll just jump on the train and maybe I walk 5 minutes at the other end and I can just go there. No big deal. Yeah, that freedom of movement uh, was really, really something that I treasured while I lived there for sure.
Have you been or were you able to visit any other cities in Russia other than Moscow and Sakhalin?
Yeah, so actually, one of the very first things after I think I had only been in Moscow for about 2 months, maybe at most. And a colleague of mine and I decided that for the New Year's holiday, we were going to take the train up to Murmansk. And we were just like, it was just sort of a spontaneous, it was his idea, really. And I sort of tagged along, but that was really, really fun, actually. I would recommend doing that. Obviously, the better your Russian is, the more of a sort of in-depth experience you'll probably have. But even with our limited Russian at the time, it was pretty straightforward. And yeah, it was really, really fun to just take the train up and have everything slowly get darker and darker as you get up to Murmansk. And that was a really interesting city as well, especially to visit like in the middle of the winter time. It's the coldest I've ever felt ever in my life. But I've been to the Arctic Circle now, so I can cross that off the list. So I really liked Murmansk. People there were really lovely as well. I mean, they always say, I guess, in colder places, people have like the warmer hearts, and I definitely felt like that was true in Murmansk for sure. Like everybody there was just like, "What are you doing here? Let's make sure you're warm. Do you have enough cacao? Like, can I get you anything?" Like they were just very, very nice. And we also, let's see what else have I done. Visited a colleague's family in Bryansk. That was definitely my first foray into like real Russia, I think was visiting their dacha outside of Bryansk. Also took the train out there. Very briefly visited Baikal, not the lake, but we went to the city. And that was interesting. I had a very weird drink there. Anyway, and then let's see, have we gone anywhere else? I think those were and to Kolomna. Kolomna was the last place I actually went before I left Russia outside of Moscow. And that was very pretty too. I could see why tourists liked going there. But I really wish I really have a lot of regrets about not doing more travel within Russia. I guess it was just Moscow is so all encompassing that in some ways it's easy to forget that there is like anything outside of it when you're living there.
But speaking about Moscow, would you be able to tell us the story about your first week as an English teacher in Moscow?
Yeah, sure. Well, that'll certainly get us into the school situation. Yeah, so as I said, the school that I worked for, they were a pretty well-oiled machine about bringing foreign teachers over to Moscow. So they made the transition into living in the city pretty easy. Picked us up at the airport, dropped us off, had gotten us apartments, gave us an advance on our first salary so that we had rubles. So that was all fine. But I do remember it was November when I moved to Moscow. So there was this maybe, I don't know, there was a little bit of snow, not too much yet. And I just remember being dropped off at the apartment and just looking out the window and thinking like, oh my God, I'm in Russia. That's so cool. And there's snow on the ground. Of course there is. And the very first thing I did was go to the grocery store. And this was the first real test of my Cyrillic reading abilities. And I managed not to buy milk by mistake. I got kefir,
Uh,
which I thought was milk. So you can imagine putting that on my cereal the next day. I was a bit like, what
what
is
is going
this?
on?
Yeah, which was so stupid. My students thought that was very funny though, so but yeah, so I went to the grocery store. It was the very first thing I did, and I was just like getting random things, and I was just like, oh, this looks interesting. Oh, the pictures on all the packaging are different. Oh, how fun. And then going actually into the classroom for the first time, I felt very underprepared. It sounds like you had somewhat of a similar experience with your school, but Yeah, they did not really prepare us very well. Um, a lot of the people that they had working there had never been teachers before, or are certainly not like full-time teachers. And they were just a bit like, oh, it's fine. You have the textbook, you'll be fine. Just, give them a good experience, basically. And I was terrified because I was convinced I was going to get fired. I was like, these students are going to complain. They're going to know. I have no idea what I'm doing. But they were all very, very lovely. The first class that I taught, I believe it was like a pre-intermediate class. And they were just really jazzed because it was their first class too, I guess, just by chance. And so they were like, "Oh, you're from the US. Like, tell us about that." And they were just like really excited to just have a bit of a chat. And it was a smaller group. And that made me feel a lot more comfortable. Like, oh, okay, yeah, let's draw a map. Let's talk about directions. I can do that. Okay, cool. So I would say that the students generally did a better job giving me a good first week than the administration did. Although the admin staff was pretty good, but the actual like higher up administration, no, they didn't care if we did well or not. As long as the students paid for the classes again, they were a bit like, that's fine, mission accomplished.
I guess that's commercial schools versus the school system.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I would actually hear like them talk about their experiences going to like proper schools, no, none of the some of the shenanigans that went on at the school I worked for would have been tolerated in a proper school in Moscow. Absolutely not. No, that was a huge shock to me. More than anything else, I think was the very low expectations,
Yeah.
both of our teaching abilities and the outcomes for any of their clients. That was a huge, huge surprise because I had the idea of like, oh no, there's going to be a lot of oversight. There's going to be a lot of training. There's going to be very high expectations in terms of student outcomes.
So we talked a little bit about your first week as an English teacher. Would you be able to reveal any state secrets, as they're called? Some nightmare stories from your experience?
Oh, yeah. So the funny thing about the school I work for, first of all, I'll just preface it by saying I don't think this was unique by any means, unfortunately, to this company specifically. But yeah, there was just the incompetence of things that would happen at this school were just it was like every level. Like, what's the Russian expression? The fish stinks from the head down.
Yeah, or rots?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can say that
Both.
about this experience. So it was just, oh God, I don't even know where to start. Like we had weird things that happened that were external. Like for example, we had a bomb threat at one of the branches of our school once. It wasn't serious in the sense that it turned out the guy was just drunk and belligerent and just like saying things, but it really freaked everyone out. So there was that, which I wouldn't blame the school for, but that was weird. But then there were also just like weird things about the people they would hire because they just did not have good hiring practices. Like I could say for sure that they did not actually do background checks on any of the people that they hired. Like I could say that for sure because they would have known. Like we had one guy who had not only like I don't even know how he got a visa to be honest because we actually found the newspaper articles about this like he had been arrested in England for stalking his ex-girlfriend and like being yeah like very
Wow.
threatening towards her. And so then he came to Russia and he ended up getting ill. So when they found out that he was very sick, they actually like fired him because they were like, "Oh, you didn't disclose that you were like ill." And so then he came back and he threatened to sue the school for sexual harassment because they had sent some of the admin girls to like take care of him at the hospital, not like take care of him, but like to make sure that he was getting treatment or whatever. And so he was claiming that they had been improprietous towards him, which of course was
Oh,
ridiculous.
yeah.
And so they fired all of the admin girls that they had sent to his hospital just completely unceremoniously. And then after that, it came out that he actually had not been dying in the first place. Like he had over exaggerated his illness and just wanted to like sue them to get money. That was weird. And like it was just a lot of things like that, like general
Incompetent?
incompetence of a lot of
Uh,
the teachers.
oh my gosh. Yeah, I was just going to ask about like the like not doing background checks. Would you say like that's incompetence, or do you think it's more that they like teachers were in demand, or do you think it's just incompetence that they didn't do the background checks?
Honestly, I couldn't even tell you because I feel like on some level it was sort of both. Like I think
Mhm.
it was just sort of like,
It'll be
well,
okay.
we could, yeah, it's just sort of like we'll take a chance on this person, whatever. Because it was such a revolving door when I worked there,
Mm.
especially towards the end of people like coming in and out, that it was just sort of like, I genuinely don't understand how this is cost effective the way you're doing this. Like you must be spending so much money to try to hire these people that then you either fire in the first week that they're there or they quit. Like we had one teacher who would had only been there for 1 or 2 weeks. And then one of the scheduling coordinators emailed him and said, oh, can you cover such and such a class? And he just sent her a picture of an airplane at the airport, like he left. And so it was just somewhat of a revolving door. So I'm not really sure what came first, the need for people because of the high turnover rate, or them not doing background checks because they were just too lazy to do it, or whatever. Like, I'm not sure. Like, maybe they just thought, oh, like how bad could it be? Some of the people are fine. I really couldn't tell you.
It's really surprising to hear that the industry is such a revolving door because
It was
these
then anyway.
yeah, these schools go through such a rigorous process to bring people here. You would think like why not just take that extra step and look into them a bit more and make sure that you're investing in people long term.
I have no idea. I really will say though that I think having worked just in the industry for now about 10 years, it's sort of my impression that it is kind of a chicken and the egg thing where it's like I think a lot of schools, and I don't think this is like specific to Russia. I think this is unfortunately true of the teaching English abroad industry just in general. But I get the impression that it's sort of like the schools don't want to invest in their teachers because they're thinking, oh, these people are not here long term. So what's the point? But then also the people when they go there as teachers, they're sort of like maybe they would have stayed if there would have been more investment in them and more professional development, but they don't because they're like, well, I don't feel like I don't feel like very important at this institution. I don't feel very protected. I don't feel like I matter very much. So then they leave. So I'm not really sure. I think it's just a vicious cycle within that industry, unfortunately. And I am always really glad when I hear about companies that don't do it that way because I think unfortunately for the most part that's a little bit unusual.
Speaking about Moscow, would you
Mm,
be able to name the top five things that you couldn't live without in Moscow? Maybe Mumu is
yes.
one of them.
Well, that was actually probably genuinely true. I don't know where I would have eaten all my lunches except at that wine bar with their little charcuterie boards. But yeah, no, I think the first thing that this like comes to my mind immediately when you asked me this before was oblupichovi chai. I freaking loved that. I had never had that flavor of juice or mors or chai or anything like that before. And I don't remember why I discovered it, but I was just like so obsessed with it. Like every time I could get the mors version, I had like a bottle in the fridge. I just really liked it. And I had never had it until I moved to Sakhalin actually. And then I came back and I was like, I need to find this. And I was super chuffed that the TGI Fridays, that was the closest restaurant to the other branch I worked at, they had that as one of their regular like tea options. So I got it all the time. I was obsessed. Can't find it here. It's very upsetting. I also, oh God, the metro. I mean, enough could not be said about the metro. Like, I was definitely one of those people who was like on my day off, I'm just gonna ride the metro around and pop up in random locations and
Yes.
just see what's going on. Um, Loved the metro. But again, enough could not be said about that experience and just having a place to just kind of like go from. I mean, it was just I love the metro. What else did I say? I guess maybe Moo Moo now that we've talked about it could be. I do miss their little cow dishes. Um, I really miss my students, honestly, and just the job. Even though the company I worked for, I don't really have very many good things to say for. I had so many good experiences as a result of that, and I think that that is something that I do genuinely miss. And I think that that was something that was specific to Moscow as well, just because there are so many different people who live in the city who come there from all over the country and other places too. that affords you the opportunity to really get a very diverse experience in terms of the people that you get to meet and then the experiences because of that that you get to have. I was teaching business English for part of my time there, and so we actually would travel to all of these different companies where the learners worked, and that was a really, really cool experience. I miss sort of my little um, high-powered like metro mornings, get off at like 6 o'clock to go to some like, I don't know, like some bank or something like that, and then you get your special badge and you feel just very VIP getting to go up and work with these high and like executive people and just teach them English while they're like doing whatever spreadsheets they're working on, you know, like that was a really, really cool thing that I really miss. Um, and I think the parks too, specifically, like for a city that size to be that green, I've never really seen that
Yeah.
anywhere else. And just how easy it was to have that kind of natural enrichment in a huge city like that. To be like, I just need a second, I'm just gonna go to like some random park, and you could actually get so far away from the street you couldn't even hear the cars anymore, and you'd still be in the middle of the city. I think that's just something that I haven't really been able to experience in many other places, if anywhere else. I don't know if that's 4 or 5, but I would say something like that.
Okay, Ren. So thank you for answering all of those questions, and
Thank you
thank
for
you for
having
joining us
me.
and sharing us with us your experience being a teacher in Russia.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It was such a good trip down memory lane. I hadn't thought about like Moo or Shokoladnitsa or any of that in a little while. So I'm just like, ah, dang, I can't just go there now, but you should if you're there.
Yes,
Try Moo. It
I
is
think
kind of trash, but it's fun.
I definitely will try Moo. Maybe there's some nice merch there as well.
Listen, you know, everything's a good experience. And they have, if you like cow print, they have